Think about everything you've been working toward lately. The goals you've set, the things you want to buy, the version of your life you're trying to build. More income, a better apartment, more recognition, more time, more of everything. Now ask yourself honestly, when was the last time getting something you wanted actually made you feel like enough? Maybe for a few days, maybe for a week. And then, without even realizing it, the feeling faded, and you were already looking at the next thing. We live in a world that is constantly telling us we are not enough, that we need more to be happy, more to be respected, more to finally feel at peace. And most of us have believed it. We've built our entire lives around chasing that feeling. We work harder, sacrifice more, push further, convinced that somewhere on the other side of enough, there is peace waiting for us. But here's what the Stoics understood 2,000 years ago that most people still haven't figured out. The peace you're looking for is not on the other side of more. It's on the other side of less. Not less effort, not less ambition, less noise, less clutter, less wanting. And the moment you understand what that actually means, not just as a concept, but as a way of living, your entire relationship with life begins to shift. That's what this video is about. Not a minimalism trend, not decluttering your closet, but the deep Stoic understanding of why we suffer, why we can never seem to feel like enough, and what to actually do about it. If you stay until the end, you'll walk away with a completely different way of seeing what you have and what you don't actually need. Before we get into it, if this kind of content speaks to you, hit subscribe. It's free, and it helps us reach more people who are ready to hear this. Let's get into it. Have you ever scrolled through your phone and felt fine, and then suddenly felt like your life wasn't enough? You weren't unhappy a minute ago. Nothing changed. But now, after seeing someone else's vacation, someone else's apartment, someone else's success, you feel behind, like you're missing something you didn't even know you wanted. That's not an accident. That's comparison. And it is one of the most effective ways to guarantee that you will never feel like enough, no matter how much you actually have. The Stoics saw this pattern clearly. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, words he never intended anyone else to read, "How much more damage anger and grief do to us than the things that cause them." He wasn't talking about external events. He was talking about the stories we tell ourselves about those events, the comparisons we make, the gap we constantly measure between where we are and where we think we should be. That gap is manufactured, and the more we feed it, the wider it gets. Think about someone who just got a promotion. For a moment, they feel great. Then they find out a colleague got a bigger one, and suddenly the promotion they worked 2 years for feels like a consolation prize. Nothing changed externally, but internally, everything shifted, because comparison rewrote the story. This happens with money, with relationships, with success, with bodies, with homes. There is always someone ahead of you on whatever ladder you're climbing. Always. Which means if comparison is the standard, you will never arrive. Epictetus understood this completely. He said, "Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants." Read that again slowly. The person with the least wants is the wealthiest person in the room. Not because they've given up, not because they've settled, but because they've stopped measuring their life by someone else's ruler. So ask yourself right now, who are you comparing yourself to? And is that comparison actually pointing you towards something meaningful? Or is it just making you feel like less than you are? Here's what actually changes things. The only comparison worth making is between who you are today and who you were yesterday. That's it. That's the only race worth running. So how do you start breaking the comparison habit in real life? First, notice when it's happening. Most of the time, comparison is unconscious. You don't decide to feel behind, you just suddenly are. Catching it in the moment is the first step. Second, ask yourself what you actually value. Not what looks good, not what earns approval, but what genuinely matters to you when no one is watching. Most of what we're chasing isn't even ours. It came from someone else's idea of a good life. And finally, practice returning to what's already here, not what's missing, not what someone else has. What is actually present in your life right now that you would genuinely miss if it were gone? That shift, from measuring what's missing to accounting for what's here, is where Stoic minimalism begins. Not in what you throw away, in what you choose to see. Number 2. Here's something nobody tells you when you're trying to build a better life. Every single thing you own costs you something beyond its price tag. Space to store it, time to maintain it, mental energy to keep track of it, worry when it breaks, gets lost, or becomes outdated. The more you accumulate, the more of yourself gets distributed across your possessions. And at some point, without you even noticing, your things start owning more of you than you own of them. The Stoics called this out directly. Seneca, one of the wealthiest men in ancient Rome, wrote about watching the richest people of his time and noticing something strange. The more they had, the more anxious they became, not less, more. He wrote, "The man who is everywhere is nowhere." He was describing distraction, but it applies perfectly to possessions. A person whose attention is scattered across 100 things they own, 100 commitments, 100 concerns, that person is never fully present anywhere. Think about that drawer in your home. You know the one, full of things you keep meaning to deal with. Every time you open it, it takes a small piece of your attention. Not a big piece, but a piece. And multiply that by every room, every closet, every obligation, every subscription, every relationship you maintain out of obligation rather than love. That's not life. That's a slow drain. Have you ever moved to a new place and felt, just for a moment, like everything was clean and possible? That feeling wasn't the new apartment. That was you, temporarily free of everything you'd been carrying. Epictetus spent years as a slave. He owned almost nothing, and yet he is remembered as one of the most internally free human beings who ever lived. He once said, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." Not because poverty is noble, but because he understood something most people spend their whole lives missing: that what you carry shapes how you move through the world. So here's the question worth sitting with. For every significant thing in your life right now, every possession, every commitment, every relationship, every obligation, ask yourself, is what this gives me worth what it's taking from me? Not just financially, in time, in attention, in peace of mind. Some things that cost nothing in money cost everything in mental space. The email inbox that has 4,000 unread messages, the hobby you've been meaning to return to for 3 years but never do, the friendship that only ever leaves you feeling tired. These aren't neutral, they're weight, and you are allowed to set them down. So how do you start? First, identify one thing in your life, just one, that you are holding on to out of guilt, habit, or obligation rather than genuine value. You don't have to act on it today, just name it. Second, before you bring something new into your life, ask, does this earn its place? Not just, is this useful sometimes, but does what it gives you justify what it will take? And finally, remember that subtraction is a skill. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a practice, not a project. Number 3. Here's a question that sounds simple, but will tell you everything about why you can't feel at peace. When you get the thing you're working toward right now, the money, the job, the relationship, the goal, how long do you think the satisfaction will last? If you're honest with yourself, you already know the answer. A few days, maybe a month, and then you'll adjust. The new thing will become the normal thing, and the wanting will start again, pointing at something new. This isn't a character flaw, it's human nature. Psychologists call it the hedonic treadmill. You work hard to move forward, but the baseline keeps rising, so you never actually get ahead in terms of how you feel. But here's what most people don't realize. The Stoics identified this exact mechanism 2,000 years ago, and they had a solution for it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." He wasn't performing humility. He was writing in his private diary, never intended to be read by anyone. He was telling himself the truth. The most powerful man in the world, with access to more wealth and luxury than almost anyone alive at that time. And his private conclusion was that very little is needed. Because he understood something that the wanting machine inside all of us refuses to accept. More doesn't fix the wanting. Only choosing to stop wanting fixes the wanting. Think about a time when you genuinely felt content. Not excited, not celebrating, just quietly, solidly okay. What were you doing? Where were you? Most people, when they think carefully about this, realize it wasn't during a moment of great acquisition. It was during a moment of simple presence, a conversation, a walk, a meal, a quiet morning. Those moments don't cost anything, and yet they're the ones we actually remember. Have you ever noticed that the anticipation of something is often better than the thing itself? You plan a vacation for months, and when you finally arrive, it's good, but it's not the same as what you imagined. That gap between what we expect and what we get is where so much human unhappiness lives. Seneca wrote, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more that is poor." By that definition, poverty has nothing to do with your bank account. It has everything to do with the state of your wanting. The man with very little, who wants nothing more, is rich. The man with everything, who still craves more, is poor. So how do you actually work with this in your own life? First, practice naming what you already have. Not as a gratitude exercise in the motivational sense, but as an honest accounting. If you listed everything that was genuinely working in your life right now, how long would that list be? Second, the next time you feel a strong want, pause before acting on it. Just pause. Ask, is this something I genuinely need? Or is it the wanting machine doing what it always does? And finally, make the decision deliberately, not someday, not when things are different, but right now, today. Enough. This is enough. Not forever, not without growth, but right now, this is enough. That decision changes everything. Number 4. Think about how much energy you spend every single day on things you cannot change. What other people think of you. Whether your plans will work out. What the economy does. How someone you care about chooses to behave. What happens next week. next month, next year. Now, think about how much of that energy has ever actually changed those things. Almost none of it. Because those things were never yours to control. And yet, we spend enormous amounts of our lives trying to manage them anyway, and then feel exhausted and frustrated when nothing changes. This is one of the most fundamental teachings in all of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus called it the dichotomy of control. Everything in life falls into one of two categories: things within your control and things outside your control. Within your control, your thoughts, your choices, your effort, your response to what happens. Outside your control, everything else. He said, make the best use of what is in your power and take the rest as it happens. That sentence is simple. Living it is one of the hardest things a human being can do. Because we are wired to try to manage outcomes. We want certainty. We want to know that what we do will produce the result we want. And when we can't guarantee that, when the outcome is genuinely outside our hands, we feel unsafe. So we keep trying to control it anyway. Have you ever lost sleep over a conversation you haven't had yet? Rehearsing what you'll say, imagining what they'll say back, running through every possible outcome, and then the actual conversation happens, and it goes completely differently from anything you imagined. All of that energy, the hours of rehearsal, the anxiety, the mental loops, it changed nothing about the actual outcome. The only thing it changed was how you felt while you were waiting. That is what unchecked control-seeking does. It drains you without protecting you. Marcus Aurelius faced this daily as emperor. Wars with uncertain outcomes. Political betrayals he couldn't prevent. A plague he couldn't stop. And his daily discipline was to ask one question: is this mine to carry? If yes, act, fully, completely, without hesitation. If no, release it. Not suppress it, not push it down. Actually let it go. Think about how much lighter your life would be if you genuinely stopped carrying the things that were never yours to carry. Not the job you might not get. Not the opinion of someone who barely knows you. Not the future you can't see yet. Not the past you can't change. Just set them down. This isn't passivity. The Stoics were not passive. They acted with full force on everything within their power. But they wasted zero energy on what wasn't. So, how do you start practicing this? First, when you feel anxious or stressed, ask one question: is this within my control or outside it? Just naming which category something falls into creates immediate distance from it. Second, for everything outside your control, practice the phrase, "This is not mine to carry." Not as a dismissal, as a genuine release. And finally, redirect. Every time you catch yourself worrying about something you can't change, ask, what can I do right now with what I have? That question always has an answer. Number 5. When was the last time you sat in complete silence? No music, no podcast, no phone in your hand, no TV in the background. Just silence. If you're like most people, the honest answer is that you can't remember. or that the silence lasted about 45 seconds before you reached for something to fill it. We have built our entire lives around noise. Constant input, constant stimulation. Something in the ears, something on the screen, something demanding attention at every moment. And most of us call this productivity, or relaxation, or staying informed. But here's what's actually happening. We are using noise to avoid something. And what we're avoiding is ourselves. The Stoics treated silence not as emptiness, but as one of the most important forms of discipline a person could practice. Epictetus warned his students repeatedly about the danger of unnecessary speech, of filling every moment with words and sounds and reactions that add nothing. He said, "Better to be silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt." But the deeper point wasn't about what you say to others. It was about what happens when you stop feeding yourself noise. Because the person who cannot sit quietly with themselves for 10 minutes is, in a very real sense, running from something. And whatever you run from doesn't disappear. It follows you. It shows up in your relationships, in your decisions, in the low-grade anxiety that hums underneath even your busiest days. Think about the last time you were truly bored. Not waiting for something, genuinely bored. No entertainment, no distraction, nothing to do. Most people describe it as uncomfortable, almost unbearable. But that discomfort is information. It's telling you what's underneath the noise. And what's underneath, once you face it, loses its power over you. Have you ever noticed that your best ideas don't come when you're staring at a screen? They come in the shower, on a walk, in that half-awake state before you fall asleep. In the rare moments when your mind has nothing to process and creates space for something new. That's not a coincidence. That's what silence produces. Marcus Aurelius made time every day for what he called returning to himself. Not meditation in the modern sense, just deliberate stillness. Space to think clearly, to observe his own mind, to separate what mattered from what didn't. He wrote, "Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present." That kind of clarity doesn't come from noise. It only comes from silence. So here's what to try. This week, create one window of silence each day. Not an hour, not even 20 minutes. Start with 5. Put the phone down. Turn off the background noise. Just sit. Notice what comes up. Notice what you've been too busy to feel. First, don't fill the discomfort immediately. Let it be there. It will pass faster than you think. Second, treat silence like an appointment you keep with yourself. Not something you do when there's nothing else to do, but something you protect. And finally, pay attention to what you notice in those quiet moments. That's where the real you lives. Number 6. Here is a Stoic practice that sounds strange the first time you hear it. Deliberately give things up. Not permanently, not as punishment, but temporarily, intentionally, as a way of testing your own relationship with the things you think you need. Seneca practiced this regularly. Occasionally, he would choose to eat the simplest food available: bread, water, nothing more. He would wear plain clothing even when he had access to better. He would sleep on a simple mat instead of his usual bed. And then he would ask himself one question: is this the condition I feared? Almost always the answer was no. The discomfort he had been avoiding, the simplicity, the lack of comfort, was actually fine. In many ways, it was clarifying. This practice has a name in Stoic philosophy: voluntary discomfort. And the point isn't to suffer. The point is to discover what you actually need versus what you've simply become used to. We confuse comfort with necessity constantly. The warm shower you can't imagine starting the day without. The coffee you feel you can't function without. The phone you check within minutes of waking up. The background noise you keep running because silence feels wrong. These aren't needs, they're habits. Some of them, without your realizing it, have quietly become walls between you and a simpler, more grounded way of living. Have you ever had a power outage for a full day? At first, frustrating. Then, something strange happens. You talk more. You notice more. You get genuinely tired in the evening instead of overstimulated. And at some point you think, this isn't so bad. That's voluntary discomfort teaching you something. Not that electricity is bad, but that you are more adaptable than your comforts have let you believe. Marcus Aurelius returned to this principle again and again. He reminded himself not to value what could be taken away, not to build his peace on foundations that could crumble, not to need anything so badly that its absence would break him. He wrote, "Receive without pride, relinquish without struggle." That's the goal. Not to acquire less necessarily, but to hold everything more lightly. To know that you could let go and be okay. Think about the things in your life you feel you absolutely cannot live without. Now, imagine, temporarily, choosing to go without one of them for a single day. Not because you have to, because you want to find out what it reveals. That experiment almost always produces the same result. You realize you are stronger, more adaptable, and less dependent than you thought. And that realization, that quiet confidence in your own resilience, is worth more than any comfort you temporarily gave up. So, how do you try this? First, choose something small. One comfort you reach for daily without thinking. For one day, consciously choose not to reach for it. Second, pay attention to what that reveals, not just about the habit, but about your relationship to ease and difficulty. And finally, notice the feeling on the other side, not deprivation, something closer to clarity. That clarity is what the Stoics were building toward. Not poverty, freedom. Number 7.
Here is something worth considering. Right now, in this moment, how much of your attention is actually here? Not thinking about tomorrow, not replaying something that happened earlier, not half listening while part of your mind is somewhere else entirely. If you're being honest, probably not all of it. Most of us walk through most of our days split between the present moment and somewhere else in our heads. In a conversation we haven't had yet. In a version of tomorrow we're either dreading or longing for. In a mistake we made 3 weeks ago that we're still carrying. And while we're there, in the past or the future, our actual life is happening without us. The Stoics were relentless about this. Marcus Aurelius came back to it constantly in his private journals. He wrote simply, "Confine yourself to the present." 3 words, one of the hardest things a human being can practice. Because the mind doesn't want to stay here. It's built to wander, into planning, into worrying, into comparison, into regret. That wandering served our ancestors well, but in a modern life, it creates a particular kind of suffering. the suffering of never actually being where you are. Think about the last meaningful conversation you had. Were you fully there? Or were you composing your response while the other person was still talking? Were you checking your phone in your head, thinking about what came next? We do this constantly, and the cost is invisible because we're so used to it. We're missing our own lives, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, continuous fragments. Have you ever been somewhere beautiful? A sunset, a peaceful morning, a moment with someone you love, and felt like you couldn't quite take it in? Like there was glass between you and the experience. That glass is distraction. It's the accumulated weight of being somewhere else so often that presence itself starts to feel unfamiliar. Epictetus taught that the present moment is the only thing you ever actually have. The past is gone. The future isn't here yet. This moment, right now, is the only place where anything real can happen. And the irony is that the more you train yourself to be here, the better you get at the things that actually matter. Better conversations, better decisions, better work, better relationships. Because all of those happen in the present. So, how do you practice this? First, pick one daily activity, a meal, a walk, a conversation, and commit to being fully there. Not multitasking, not half present, fully there. Second, when you notice your mind has drifted, and it will drift constantly, don't judge it. Just return. The practice is in the returning, not in staying perfectly still. And finally, treat presence like a skill you build, not a state you achieve. Every time you notice you've drifted and come back, that's a rep. That's training. The things you already have, your relationships, your health, your capacity to think and feel and choose, start to look completely different when you're actually there to see them. Not because they changed, because you arrived. Number 8.
Here is the story most of us are living, even if we've never said it out loud. When I get there, I'll be happy. When I make enough money. When I lose the weight. When the relationship is right. When the career is where I want it. When the kids are older. When things settle down. When I finally feel ready. We keep moving the line. We keep telling ourselves that peace is one more achievement away, and so we delay our own contentment indefinitely, always working toward it, never quite arriving. The Stoics saw this trap with absolute clarity. Seneca wrote one of the most important sentences in all of ancient philosophy. If you want to make a person happy, do not add to his possessions. Take away from his desires. The math of contentment is not addition, it is subtraction. More things do not create contentment. Fewer desires do. And this is not a passive statement. It is one of the most radical ideas a person can choose to live by, because it means that the peace you're waiting for isn't contingent on anything happening first. You can choose it now. Not by pretending your problems don't exist, not by suppressing what's difficult, but by making a deliberate decision right now with your life as it actually is, that this is enough. Think about what that would mean in practice. Not someday when things are better. Today, with this income, these relationships, this body, this career, this version of your life. What if you looked at all of it, the imperfect, still in progress, not quite where you want it version, and decided
It was enough. Have you ever met someone who seemed genuinely at peace? Not someone who had everything figured out, but someone who moved through their life with a kind of quiet okayness. They weren't passive. They still worked toward things, but they weren't at war with where they were. That's not a personality type. That's a practice. And it starts with a decision. Marcus Aurelius had every reason to be dissatisfied. His empire was under constant threat. He dealt with plague, betrayal, war. His personal life was complicated. He had every external excuse to be miserable. And yet, his private journals are filled with deliberate returns to gratitude, to presence, to the recognition that what he already had was enough. He wrote, "Do not indulge in dreams of the life you might have lived. Be what you are and do what you can." Not be what you wish you were. Be what you are. This is the hardest and most liberating thing Stoic minimalism asks of you. Not to give up, not to stop growing, but to stop living in the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. That gap is where your suffering lives, not in your circumstances, in the story you tell about your circumstances. So here is what to actually do. First, right now, name 3 things in your life you would genuinely miss if they were gone tomorrow. Not things you're chasing, things you already have. Second, say the words, even just quietly to yourself, "This is enough." Notice how that feels. Notice what resists it. And finally, make the decision again tomorrow and the day after. Enough isn't a permanent feeling you achieve. It's a choice you keep making. That is the whole practice.
The Stoics we've talked about today, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, Epictetus, lived completely different lives. One commanded an empire, one was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, one was born with nothing and owned nothing his whole life, and all 3 arrived at the same place. That the good life is not the full life, it's the clear one, the one where you know what matters, where you are not owned by your possessions, where you are not defined by what you lack, where you are not at war with where you are. That life is available to you, not someday, right now. It doesn't require more, it requires less. If this video gave you something real to think about, please take a moment to like it and subscribe. We put out new Stoic philosophy content regularly, and it's all designed to give you something you can actually use. And in the comments, tell me this. What is one thing you're ready to want less of? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, own less, live more.